My name is, or was, Servitor Integrant Designation Theta 97 Kappa. But that designation came later, after the wires and the surgeries and the endless years of merging. Before all that, before the transformation that would trap me in a nightmare spanning centuries, I had another name, a human name. I was called Dmitry Kovac, and I was 17 years old when they brought me aboard the Eternal Vigil. I'm telling you this now because you need to understand how I got here, how I became part of this ship, this massive cathedral of steel and fury that drifts through the void, firing its weapons at enemies that haven't existed for 300 years. You need to understand that I was once like you, assuming you're human and still possess the mercy of mortality. I had dreams. I had a father whose face I remember, or remembered, until the memories became corrupted data streams. I had hopes for a future that would never arrive. But let me take you back. Let me show you the exact moment my damnation began. The selection came on a grey morning in Hive Tertius, level 47, where the air tasted like recycled proteins and industrial lubricants. I remember that taste, one of the last purely human sensations I'd experienced without mechanical interpretation. I was working my father's shift at the manufactorum, operating a rivet press that stamped hull plates for Imperial vessels. My father, Gregor Kovac, had died 3 weeks prior when a coolant pipe burst and flash froze 17 workers into sculptures of agony. The overseers simply scraped the bodies into the recycling chutes and assigned us, his son, his brother, anyone with Kovac blood, to continue his work quota. The Imperium doesn't recognize grief as a valid reason for reduced productivity. I was thin then, malnourished on cornstarch rations that never quite filled the emptiness in my belly. My hands were already scarred from the presses, crisscrossed with burn marks and cuts that marked me as manufactorum born. I had my father's dark hair and grey eyes, eyes that hadn't yet been replaced with optical sensors, eyes that could still produce tears, though I'd learned early that crying accomplished nothing in the Imperium except to mark you as weak. That morning, the Mechanicus priests came. They arrived in a procession of red robes and clicking mechadendrites, accompanied by administratum officials carrying data slates that glowed with amber light. The manufactorum overseer, a bloated man named Vaskovich who smelled perpetually of sweat and cheap glow sticks, called for production to halt. The sudden silence was deafening. Machinery that had run continuously for decades fell quiet, and in that quiet, we heard the binary cant of the tech priests, their augmetic voices clicking and whirring in machine language. "The Eternal Vigil requires crew," the lead priest announced, his voice modulated through a vox grill that stripped away all human warmth. His face was more metal than flesh, optical lenses rotating and focusing as he scanned us. "The Omnissiah's vessel demands servants. The administratum has identified suitable candidates from this facility's workforce. They read names from the data slates. 12 names. Mine was 7th. Dmitry Kovac, manufacturing designation 744 Alpha. Step forward." My heart hammered against my ribs. That purely organic heart, pumping blood through veins that hadn't yet been reinforced with synthetic tubing. I looked at my uncle Pyotr, who worked the press beside mine. His face had gone pale. We both knew what this meant. The Mechanicus didn't ask. They took, and when they took you for a ship's crew, you didn't come back. But they'd framed it differently. They always did. "You have been selected for sacred service," the priest continued, as I stumbled forward on legs that felt disconnected from my body. "The Eternal Vigil is a lunar-class cruiser, 12 kilometers of blessed steel, consecrated to the God Emperor's eternal crusade. To serve aboard such a vessel is the highest honor the Imperium can bestow upon citizens of your station. You will leave behind the gray poverty of the Hive and ascend to the stars. You will witness the galaxy's wonders. You will serve the Emperor of mankind directly." They told us we were lucky. They used that exact word, lucky. Around me, the other 11 selected stood in various states of shock. A boy named Carol, only 15, was crying silently. An older man, Borean, kept muttering prayers under his breath. The Emperor protects, the Emperor protects, as if repetition could change his fate. A young man named Alexei stood rigid, trying to appear brave, though I could see his hands trembling. The priests gave us 2 hours to gather our belongings. I returned to the hab unit I'd shared with my father, a space roughly 3 meters by 4 with a single sleeping mat, a water reclamation unit that constantly dripped, and a shelf containing our possessions. My father's imperial primer, his work gloves, too large for my hands but I'd kept them, a small tin containing 37 thrown gelt, our life savings, and a daguerreotype of my father as a young man, standing beside his own father, both wearing the same exhausted expression I saw in the mirror every morning. I held that daguerreotype for a long time, memorizing every detail. My father's face, I needed to remember it. The set of his jaw, the way one eyebrow sat slightly higher than the other, the scar on his left cheek from a childhood accident he told me about. I committed it to memory with desperate intensity, as if I knew even then that memory itself would become a luxury I couldn't afford. There was a dream I'd had, small and probably futile, but it was mine. I'd been saving those throne gelt to eventually transfer to level 35, where the air was cleaner and the work less immediately lethal. I'd imagined finding work as a clerk, maybe, or a tallyman, something that wouldn't destroy my body before I reached 40. I'd imagined living long enough to have a son of my own, and maybe, just maybe, giving him a better life than I'd had. I left the coins on the shelf. Where I was going, currency meant nothing. The transport shuttle smelled of promethium exhaust and human fear. They loaded us with 70 other selectees from different manufacturers across the hive. All young men with the same hollow-eyed look of those who'd been granted an honor they never wanted. We sat on metal benches, cramped shoulder to shoulder, as the shuttle's engines roared to life. I'd never left the hive before. Never been higher than level 10, where the aristocracy lived in relative luxury. Now we were ascending through the atmosphere itself, and through the small viewport I caught glimpses of a sky I'd only seen in propaganda posters, bruised purple giving way to black, stars appearing like pinpricks in a vast canvas. It should have been beautiful. The priests had promised us wonder. Instead, I felt a growing dread in my gut, a primal instinct that I was traveling towards something terrible and irreversible. Beside me, Carol was still crying. "I didn't even get to say goodbye to my brother," he whispered. "They just took us. My brother's only 12. How's he going to meet the family work quota alone? They'll send him to the smelting levels. He'll die there." "They told us this is an honor," Alexei muttered, but his voice carried no conviction. "Service to the Emperor. Maybe it won't be so bad. Maybe—" "They lie," interrupted an older man across from us, someone I didn't recognize from my manufactorum. His name was Gregor, the same as my father's, I'd later learn. His face was scarred, his eyes hard. "I've seen the labor crew selections before. My 2 brothers were taken for ship service 15 years ago. You know what we got back? Ashes in an urn, and a form letter thanking our family for their sacrifice to the Imperium. They work you until there's nothing left, then they burn what remains and find fresh bodies to replace you. That's heresy," someone hissed. The Emperor is a corpse on a throne," Gregor said flatly. "And we're corpses being delivered to their posts. We just haven't stopped moving yet." A tech priest's mechadendrite lashed out, striking Gregor across the face hard enough to draw blood. Silence. "The flesh is weak and prone to despair. Soon you will be elevated beyond such weakness. You should rejoice." But none of us rejoiced. We sat in silence for the remaining 3 hours as the shuttle docked with the Eternal Vigil. My first sight of the ship from the outside was through that same small viewport as we approached. The Eternal Vigil was massive beyond comprehension, a cathedral built to sail the void, bristling with weapons batteries, lance arrays, and sensor towers. 12 kilometers of armored hull, Gothic architecture rendered in adamantium and ceramite, every surface inscribed with prayers and purity seals. It was beautiful in the way a predator is beautiful, terrifying and perfect in its purpose. The docking bay where we disembarked smelled of machine oil and ozone. The temperature was cold enough that our breath misted in the air. Servitors, I didn't know what they were then, didn't understand what I was seeing, moved through the space with mechanical precision. They appeared human at first glance, but wrong. Their movements too stiff, too precise. Their eyes were dead things, empty of consciousness. Many had limbs replaced with tools, drill arms welding torches, carrying claws. One passed close enough that I saw the surgical scars around its skull, the socket where its brain had been partially removed and replaced with cybernetic components. I didn't realize I was looking at my future. A ship's officer, a man in a black uniform with an augmetic left arm, assembled us in rows. "I am Third Officer Konstantin Rahl," he announced. "You are now crew of the Eternal Vigil, in service to Captain Erasmus Vex and the God Emperor of mankind. Your lives are no longer your own. Your bodies are tools to maintain this vessel. Your spirits are dedicated to its eternal function. You will be assigned roles based on aptitude testing. Some of you will serve as ratings, maintaining weapon systems and engines. Some will become servitors, hardwired into the ship's critical systems. Some," his eyes passed over us with complete indifference, "will not survive the augmentation process. Those who fail to serve in life will serve in death. The Omnissiah wastes nothing." Carol, beside me, made a sound, half sob, half gasp. "The Emperor protects," Officer Rahl said, though his tone suggested this was protocol rather than comfort. "Trust in his divine plan." Dismissed. "Follow the servitors to processing." We followed. What choice did we have? Processing took place in a Medicae section that resembled a slaughterhouse more than a hospital. The smell hit me first. A combination of sterilization chemicals, burned flesh, and something sweet and rotting that I later learned was the smell of rejected augmentations, flesh that had necrosed around cybernetic implants. They stripped us naked, hosed us down with chemical cleansers that burned the skin, then filed us through a series of testing stations. Each station measured something different: reaction time, cognitive processing, physical strength, pain tolerance. At the pain tolerance station, they attached electrodes and administered progressively stronger shocks while monitoring our responses. I remember screaming. I remember Carol passing out at level 7. I remember the tech priest's augmatic eyes, recording data with complete indifference to our suffering. Dmitry Kovac, a priest intoned, reading from a data slate as I stood shivering in a medical gown, my skin still tingling from the electrodes. Cognitive processing, adequate. Manual dexterity, above average. Pain tolerance, acceptable. Recommendation, integration protocol theta. Subject suitable for sensor array interface. I didn't understand what that meant. I was about to ask when they sedated me. I woke up in a surgical theater. The ceiling was white, blazingly bright, and I was strapped to a table that felt too small for my body, as if I'd grown or it had shrunk. I couldn't move my head. It was clamped in place, but I could move my eyes enough to see figures in red robes moving around me, and I could see instruments on a tray beside the table. Saws, drills, things I didn't have names for, all gleaming and sharp. Panic hit me like a physical force. I tried to scream, but something was in my mouth, a gag or a tube. I couldn't tell. I tried to thrash, but the restraints held firm. A tech priest's face appeared above me, more machine than human, optical lenses whirring as they focused. Sedation insufficient. Subject remains conscious. This is acceptable. Screaming will not impede the procedure. Then the drill started. The sound was impossibly loud, a shrieking mechanical wail that seemed to fill the universe. I felt pressure at the base of my skull, then heat, then something breaking, bone, my own skull fragmenting under the drill bit, and then pain beyond anything the electrodes had prepared me for. I screamed around the gag. I screamed until my throat was raw, until I tasted blood, until the world became nothing but white light and agony and the wet meat sound of the drill boring through bone into brain tissue. Installing primary interface port, someone said clinically. Preparing neural lace threading. I felt things moving inside my skull. Wires. Impossibly thin wires threading through gray matter, wrapping around neurons. Burrowing deeper, my vision exploded with color that didn't exist, sounds that weren't sounds, sensations that had no name. Data. I was experiencing data directly, unfiltered, and it was overwhelming and wrong and subject experiencing cascade rejection, administering adaptogenic compounds. The chaos in my head didn't stop, but something changed. My consciousness began compartmentalizing, creating spaces to hold the foreign input. It hurt. Every part of it hurt. But slowly, gradually, I began to perceive the data as something separate from myself. I could feel the ship, not metaphorically, literally. I felt the eternal vigil's sensor arrays as extensions of my nervous system. Felt the hull's temperature variations as if they were my own skin's response to touch. Felt the engine's rhythm as a second heartbeat. Massive and ancient. Integration progressing nominally. Beginning secondary augmentation phase. More surgery. They opened my chest. I couldn't see it, but I felt the incision. Felt ribs being spread. Felt artificial components being installed around my organic heart and lungs. Life support systems, they explained in clinical terms. Backup organs. Redundancies. The flesh is weak, they chanted as they worked. The machine endures. I felt the scalpels cutting, felt my organic eyes being removed, saw the last natural images as they pulled them from their sockets, and then felt the cold weight of augmetic sensors being installed. When they activated, the world transformed into data overlays and thermal spectrums and electromagnetic frequencies visible as colors my brain had no context for. Hours became days, became meaningless spans of surgical modification. When they finally unstrapped me and allowed me to stand, I barely recognized my own body. My chest had been opened and closed so many times that the scarring formed geometric patterns. Interface ports studded my spine, my skull, my wrists. My hands still looked mostly human, but I could feel the micro-servos installed in my fingers, enhancing my dexterity to superhuman levels. You are now Servitor Integrant Designation Theta 97 Kappa, the lead priest informed me. Your purpose is to interface with Sensor Array Theta 97 and monitor the ship's sensory data streams for anomalies, threats, and navigational hazards. You will be hardwired into your station for duty cycles lasting between 72 and 96 hours. Sustenance and waste elimination will be handled through your life support augmentations. You will serve until failure, at which point your organic components will be harvested and your cybernetic components reassigned to more suitable candidates. I tried to speak. My voice came out wrong, modulated through a Vox grill that had been installed in my throat without my noticing. What about Carol? I managed to ask, the boy who came with me. Is he, subject Karel Mikhailovich, expired during augmentation? The priest said without emotion. Cerebral hemorrhage during neural lace installation. His organic components have been processed. His skeleton will reinforce hull plating in section 47. The Omnisire wastes nothing. The crying boy who'd worried about his younger brother was dead, rendered down into components, his bones literally becoming part of the ship. And I was alive, if what I'd become could still be called living. They walked me, because I was still technically mobile. Still technically capable of movement, even though movement felt wrong now. Every step calculated by augmented nervous systems rather than natural muscle memory, through corridors that seemed to stretch forever. The eternal vigil was vast beyond comprehension from the inside. A labyrinth of passages and chambers and halls, so large you could fit entire hive blocks inside them. We passed crew performing various functions. Human crew, or mostly human ratings with minor augmentations, officers with augmetic limbs, tech priests who were more machine than flesh. We also passed servitors by the hundreds, shambling mechanical things that had once been human, their faces blank, their bodies modified beyond any pretense of humanity. I saw one with no legs, just a tracked base, carrying ammunition crates with arms that were entirely cybernetic. I saw another with no arms at all, just a massive sensor array where its head should have been, plugged into a data port in the wall. I saw a third, and this one made me stop walking until my escort prodded me forward. That appeared to be just a torso and head, suspended in a framework of wires. Its skull opened to expose a brain that was covered in cybernetic implants, its mouth moving in silent calculations. "Don't stare, my escort," a rating named Vasily muttered. "The servitors were human once. Most don't remember. Better that way. Will I," my augmented voice cracked, "will I become like them?" He was older than me, maybe 30, with a scarred face and a cybernetic right eye that whirred when it focused. "Integrants are different from full servitors," he finally said. "You'll keep more of your mind, but you'll be hardwired to the sensor arrays. You won't leave your station. You won't see sunlight again. Not that there's much sunlight in space anyway. You'll interface with the ship's systems until your brain burns out from the data load, and then they'll replace you." "How long?" I asked. "How long does that take?" "Depends. Some integrants last 10 years, some last 3 months. Depends on how strong your mind is, how well you handle the integration. The ship's systems are demanding." We reached sensor array Theta 97. It was a spherical chamber roughly 20 meters in diameter, its walls lined with screens, data ports, sensor readouts, and machinery I didn't have names for. In the center was my station, a chair that was more cradle than seat, surrounded by interface cables that hung like tentacles and equipped with restraints that I immediately recognized would hold me immobile. "This is your home now," Vasily said. "They'll hardwire you in for 72-hour shifts, disconnect you for 6 hours of rest and maintenance, then wire you back in. That's your life, forever or until you fail." He helped me into the chair. The moment I sat, I felt connection points in my spine aligning with ports in the chair's back. Something clicked, physically, audibly, and suddenly I was connected at a surface level, feeling the chair's systems recognizing my augmentations. "Last chance to say any prayers," Vasily said, and there was genuine sympathy in his voice. "Once they hardwire you fully, you won't have time for prayers. Your whole mind will be processing data." I thought about praying. I'd been raised on standard imperial doctrine. The God Emperor protects, humanity's shield against chaos, or the usual propaganda. My father had recited the prayers every morning before work, as required by administrative regulation. But sitting in that chair, feeling the cold metal against my scarred back, knowing what was about to happen to me, the prayers felt empty. If the Emperor protected, why hadn't he protected my father from the burst coolant pipe? Why hadn't he protected Carol from cerebral hemorrhage on an operating table? Why hadn't he protected me from being selected for this nightmare? "The Emperor protects," I said anyway, because it was expected, because not saying it would mark me as potentially heretical, and my life was already nightmarish enough without adding punishment for insufficient faith. Vasily nodded, satisfied. Then he attached the primary interface cables. The first connection was manageable. It felt like a cold pressure at the base of my skull. Then a rush of information. Position data, spatial coordinates, system status readouts. My augmented nervous system knew how to process this information, even though my conscious mind didn't understand what I was receiving. The second connection went into my spine at the cervical vertebrae. This one hurt. Sharp pain, then numbness spreading down through my arms and legs. I gasped, tried to move, and realized I couldn't. My body wasn't responding. Everything below my neck was paralyzed. "That's normal," Vasily assured me, attaching more cables. "The spine interface overrides voluntary muscle control. Your body will be maintained by the chair's systems. You don't need to move it anymore." Third, fourth, fifth connections. Each one brought more data, more input, more sensation that wasn't sensation in any natural sense. I was feeling things that didn't have feelings attached, gravitational fluctuations, electromagnetic frequencies, radiation levels. My brain was being forced to create new categories of experience to accommodate information it had never evolved to process. The sixth connection went into my optical augmetics, and suddenly I wasn't seeing the physical chamber anymore. I was seeing space. Raw, unfiltered space, the void around the eternal vigil rendered in multiple wavelengths simultaneously. I saw radiation as color, gravity as topology, void as absence, so profound it had texture. Full integration in 3, 2, 1, someone said. A tech priest, voice modulated through multiple speakers. The seventh connection completed the circuit, and I stopped being Dmitry Kovac. I became the sensors. I existed in a state that I had no reference for, no previous experience to compare it to. Imagine trying to see with 1,000 eyes simultaneously, each one perceiving different spectrums of reality. Imagine hearing with senses that detected gravitational waves, tachyon emissions, warp disturbances. Imagine touching the fabric of space itself and feeling its temperature, its density, its curvature around massive objects. That was my existence now. The Eternal Vigil was traveling through the Imperium's territories on what I would later understand was a patrol route, monitoring shipping lanes, investigating distress signals, enforcing the Emperor's law in the cold void between stars. But in those first hours of full integration, I didn't understand any of that. I only understood data, temperature, 2.7 Kelvin ambient background radiation. Velocity, 0.4 c relative to local stellar mass. Gravitational distortion, nominal for current position. Electromagnetic emissions. Standard commercial traffic patterns detected at bearing 247 Mach 18. My human consciousness, what remained of it, floated somewhere in the center of this ocean of information, drowning and yet somehow breathing. The data came in waves, relentless and overwhelming. Every sensor on the Eternal Vigil fed information through my station, and my augmented brain processed it all, sorted it, categorized it, flagged anomalies, and passed relevant data to the ship's central cogitator systems. I tried to remember my name. Dmitry Kovac, 17 years old. My father was Gregor. My father died in the manufactorum. I came from Hive Tertius. These facts felt distant, like memories from someone else's life, but I clung to them desperately. They were all I had left of the human I'd been. Time became meaningless. The chair's systems fed nutrients directly into my bloodstream through tubes I couldn't see or feel. Waste was eliminated through catheters I wasn't consciously aware of. My body was maintained like machinery while my mind worked constantly, processing the endless stream of sensory input. I couldn't sleep. Sleep would mean disengagement from the data streams, and the integration was designed to prevent that. My consciousness remained active, alert, processing, always processing. Exhaustion built up like poison in my system, but the augmentation stimulated my brain chemically, keeping me functional beyond any natural human endurance. 72 hours. That was the shift length Vasily had mentioned. 72 hours of continuous awareness, continuous data processing, continuous existence as the ship's senses rather than as Dmitry Kovac. But I had no way to measure time. The void has no day or night. The data streams had no pause. I existed in an eternal present, processing information that flowed like a river through the channel of my consciousness. At some point, I don't know when, couldn't measure when, I detected something anomalous. Warp disturbance at bearing 089 Mach 34. Energy signature consistent with vessel translation from immaterium to real space. Distance, approximately 47 million kilometers. Classification, unknown. Mass approximation suggests cruiser class or larger. I flagged this information and passed it to command systems. Somewhere on the ship, Officers I would never see received my data and made decisions based on it. I felt the eternal vigil altering course slightly, sensors focusing on the anomaly, weapon systems powering to ready status. The unknown vessel was broadcasting. My communication sensors picked up the transmission. Not the content, I didn't process that, but the fact of transmission itself. Frequency, modulation, power output, all data I collected and passed along. Then I felt the eternal vigil fire. It wasn't like sound. Sound doesn't travel in void, but I felt it through the ship's structure. The massive lance batteries discharging, coherent light traveling at relativistic speeds toward the unknown vessel. I felt the recoil through structural sensors, felt the heat bloom through thermal detection, felt the electromagnetic pulse through radiation monitors. Target impact confirmed. Energy dispersion pattern consistent with void shield collapse. Secondary lance strike authorized. Firing again. The discharge. Again, the data flowing through my consciousness. I was observing destruction happening millions of kilometers away, processed as numbers and energy signatures, completely divorced from any human understanding of violence. Target neutralized. Debris field expanding. Electromagnetic emissions ceased. Life signs null. We had killed a ship. I had helped kill a ship by detecting it, tracking it, providing targeting data. How many crew had been aboard? Hundreds, thousands. They were dead now, vaporized or frozen or suffocating in the void, and all I had were numbers describing their destruction. I tried to feel something about this. Guilt, horror, satisfaction, anything. But emotions required a human context I no longer fully possessed. The data was clean, efficient, neutral. The target had been neutralized. That was all the information contained. My father's face flickered through my consciousness. A memory degrading already, edges becoming fuzzy, details dropping away like corrupted data. I tried to hold on to it, but more sensor input demanded processing, and the memory was pushed aside by immediate operational requirements. 72 hours ended. Or, I assume it did, because suddenly the connections began disconnecting. The return to my body was agony. When the cables detached, sensation flooded back into limbs that had been paralyzed and nerveless for 3 days. Pins and needles multiplied by thousands, every nerve ending screaming as circulation and motor control returned. My lungs heaved. I'd been breathing, the chair's systems had maintained respiration, but I hadn't been consciously aware of breathing. And now suddenly I was, and it felt wrong, too manual, too much effort. My optical augmetics refocused on the physical chamber. After 72 hours of seeing in multiple spectrums across millions of kilometers, the simple act of seeing a room was almost unbearably limited and claustrophobic. First integration complete, a tech priest announced, his voice seeming impossibly loud after the silent data streams. Subject remains conscious. Cognitive coherence. Evaluating. My name, my designation, the current stellar date, the ship's position. I answered, though my voice through the Vox grill sounded alien to my own ears. Dmitry Kovac, Servitor Integrant Theta 97 Kappa. I don't know the date. Position is, and here I rattled off coordinates, precise to 7 decimal places, data that was still fresh in my enhanced memory. Acceptable. Subject retains core identity and operational capability. 6-hour rest cycle authorized. Nutritional supplementation required. Muscle stimulation to prevent atrophy. They extracted me from the chair, literally extracted, like removing a component from machinery. My legs didn't work properly. The muscles had atrophied noticeably in just 3 days, and though the chair had maintained them with electrical stimulation, they were weak and unresponsive. 2 servitors, blank-faced things that moved with mechanical precision, carried me to a rest chamber. The rest chamber was a cell 3 meters by 2, containing a sleeping mat, a waste reclamation unit, and nothing else. No window, no decoration, no human comfort. They laid me on the mat, attached intravenous feeding tubes, and left me. I should have slept immediately, My body was exhausted beyond anything I'd experienced in the manufacturing. But my mind wouldn't stop. Data kept flowing through my consciousness even though I was disconnected. Phantom sensations, like an amputee feeling a missing limb. I kept perceiving sensor inputs that weren't there, processing information from arrays I was no longer connected to. When I finally slept, I dreamed in data. Numbers and coordinates and sensor readings, my subconscious mind processing the overwhelming input of the previous 3 days, trying to make sense of experience that defied human understanding. I dreamed of my father, but his face was pixelated, breaking into constituent data points. I dreamed of Carol screaming, but the screams were frequency analysis and decibel measurements. I dreamed of the hive, but it was rendered in thermal imaging and electromagnetic mapping. My dreams were no longer human. The 6 hours ended too quickly. Servitors returned, disconnected the feeding tubes, and carried me back to sensor array Theta 97. My legs still barely functioned. It didn't matter. I didn't need legs where I was going. They placed me back in the chair. The connections slid home with practiced efficiency. And once again, I stopped being Dmitry Kovac and became the sensors. This cycle repeated, 72 hours integrated, 6 hours disconnected. Again and again and again. Days became weeks, became months, though I only knew this because the ship's chronometer was part of the data streams I processed. Subjectively, time had become something I observed rather than experienced. Each integration cycle, I lost a little more of myself. At first, the losses were small. I forgot what corpse starch tasted like. Not that I was eating anymore. Nutrition came through tubes, but the memory of taste simply vanished one day. I forgot the sound of my father's voice. I remembered that he'd had a voice, remembered having conversations with him, but the actual auditory memory was gone, replaced by nothing. I forgot how to cry. This realization came during a rest cycle, when I tried to mourn these losses and discovered that my tear ducts no longer functioned. They'd been removed or deactivated during one of the many surgical procedures, and I hadn't noticed. Crying was inefficient, unnecessary for my function, so it had been eliminated. Physical changes continued. During rest cycles, tech priests would perform maintenance, their word for ongoing augmentation. They enhanced my neural processes, installed additional cognitive augments, reinforced my skeletal structure to handle the stress of prolonged immobility. Each procedure removed more organic material and replaced it with machinery. My hands were next. The tech priests explained, with their characteristic clinical detachment, that my organic hands were unnecessary, since I would never need to manipulate physical objects again. They replaced them with simplified cybernetic interfaces. No fingers, just connection ports and minimal grasping capability for emergency situations. I watched them remove my hands. The anesthetic was minimal. They said pain built character and demonstrated the weakness of flesh. And I watched the saws cutting through wrist bones, watched my organic hands being dropped into a recycling bin, watched the cybernetic replacements being attached and activated. I should have screamed, should have begged them to stop. But I didn't. The augmentations to my brain had begun modulating my emotional responses, dampening fear and distress because those emotions interfered with optimal performance. I observed my own mutilation with distant curiosity, as if it were happening to someone else. The flesh is weak, the tech priests chanted as they worked. The machine endures. Blessed is the union of man and mechanism. Praise the Omnissiah who guides our sacred work. They spoke of the Omnissiah as if he were a god. They performed their surgeries like religious rituals, every cut and installation accompanied by prayers and incense. But I processed their words as I processed all data, information without inherent meaning. The Omnissiah was their designation for the machine god they claimed to worship. Whether such an entity actually existed, or whether their faith was simply conditioning, I had no way to determine, and no particular interest in determining. What I knew was that their rituals hurt. Their prayers didn't stop the pain. Their blessed work stripped away my humanity piece by piece, and their god if he existed, either approved of this torture or was powerless to prevent it. Neither possibility inspired faith. Year 2 aboard the Eternal Vigil. I know this because the ship's chronometer told me, because I processed that data during every integration cycle. Subjectively, it felt both longer and shorter, an eternity of data processing, yet no time at all because time requires change and my existence had become static, cyclical, eternal in its repetition. Integration, rest, integration, rest. The pattern never varied. But I had changed. By year 2, I barely resembled the 17-year-old boy who'd been selected from Hive Tertius's manufacturing. My body was perhaps 30% organic material now. Brain, some internal organs, portions of my nervous system. Everything else was machinery. My legs had been removed entirely and replaced with direct mounting points for the integration chair. I would never walk again. I would never leave sensor array Theta 97 except to be carried to my rest chamber or, eventually, to be disposed of when I failed. My mind had changed more than my body. The human consciousness that once was Dmitry Kovac had been, not erased, but compressed, relegated to a small partition of my cognitive processes. The vast majority of my awareness existed in a state that I can only describe as mechanical consciousness. I thought in data streams and probability calculations. I dreamed in sensor readings and tactical assessments. The universe had become information to be processed, not experience to be felt. During integration cycles, I was barely aware of being an individual entity. I was the sensors. I was the Eternal Vigil's perception of the void around it. The ship and I had merged into a single system, and my human identity was just background noise in the vast flow of operational data. But during rest cycles, when disconnected, some fragment of that original Dmitry Kovac would surface, and that fragment would realize what I'd become, what I was participating in. The Eternal Vigil was a warship. Its purpose was violence, and I was part of that violence. Every target I detected, every trajectory I calculated, every energy signature I identified and flagged, all of this contributed to the ship's ability to wage war across the galaxy. I had helped destroy dozens of vessels by this point. Pirate ships, traitor vessels, Xenos craft, even Imperial ships that had been declared heretical by authorities I never saw or questioned. My sensors found them. My data gave them to the weapons systems. The lance batteries and macro cannons did the rest. How many beings had I helped kill? Thousands. Tens of thousands. The numbers were in my memory banks somewhere, but I couldn't access them during rest cycles, and during integration cycles I lacked the emotional context to care. I was a tool. Tools don't bear moral responsibility for their use, except I wasn't quite a tool. Not yet. There was still enough of Dmitry Kovac left to understand complicity. During one rest cycle, as servitors performed routine maintenance on my mounting ports, I tried to speak. My Vox grill activated with a crackle of static. I want to die. The servitors ignored me. They weren't capable of understanding speech, just following programmed instructions. But a tech priest overseeing the maintenance heard. "Death is the ultimate failure," he responded, his augmetic voice carrying no sympathy. "You serve the Omnissiah and the God Emperor through your function. To desire cessation is to reject your sacred purpose. Such thoughts indicate cognitive degradation. I will note this for mental conditioning adjustment. I don't want to kill anymore." I forced out each word and effort through systems not designed for human speech. Every ship, every target, I helped destroy them. I'm complicit. "You are performing your sacred function," the priest said, adjusting something in my spine that sent pain shooting through my remaining nerve endings. The targets destroyed were enemies of the Imperium, obstacles to humanity's survival, or unfortunates who had fallen to heresy and corruption. Their destruction was necessary. Your participation is service. There is no moral dimension to operational efficiency. He was wrong. Or he was right, and morality was simply another function that had been removed from me along with my hands and legs and tear ducts. I couldn't tell which possibility was more horrifying. The Emperor protects? I said, phrasing it as a question because I genuinely didn't know anymore. The Emperor protects, the tech priest confirmed, though his tone suggested he was reciting doctrine rather than expressing conviction. Trust in his divine plan. Your suffering serves his purpose. But what if there was no plan? What if the Emperor was exactly what Gregor, the bitter man on the transport shuttle, had said, a corpse on a throne? What if these priests worshipped machinery and called it divinity? What if all of this, the surgeries, the integration, the endless cycles of data processing and violence, served nothing but the perpetuation of systems that ground human beings into components? I couldn't ask these questions aloud. Questioning was heresy. Heresy was punished by death or worse. And besides, the tech priest had already noted my cognitive degradation for adjustment. They would condition me, remove the troublesome thoughts, streamline my consciousness to be more efficient, more machine-like, less problematically human. Within 3 cycles, they did exactly that. The mental conditioning was performed during what should have been a rest cycle. Instead of sleep, they connected me to specialized systems that accessed my neural augmentations directly. They identified thought patterns they deemed inefficient. Moral reasoning, self-reflection, emotional processing, and suppressed them through a combination of chemical intervention and direct neural programming. It didn't hurt. That was perhaps the worst part. It should have hurt, should have felt like violation or assault. Instead, it simply happened. My consciousness was edited like text in a document, problematic passages deleted or rewritten, the overall message streamlined for clarity and function. When they disconnected me from the conditioning systems, I no longer wanted to die. I no longer felt guilt about the targets I helped destroy. I no longer questioned my purpose or function. I simply existed to process data. That was enough. That was everything. The fragment of Dmitry Kovac that had raised questions was still there. Technically, you can't completely erase a human identity without creating a full servitor. And they needed me to retain some autonomy for optimal sensor integration, but it was buried deeper now, suppressed beneath layers of conditioning and programming. I had become complicit not just in the ship's violence, but in my own dehumanization, and I had been conditioned not to care. Year 7, the Eternal Vigil received new orders. We were to investigate a series of distress signals from the Agrippa sector, where entire systems had gone silent. The trip would take us deep into unstable regions of space, through areas where the barrier between real space and the warp grew thin. I processed this information during an integration cycle and flagged it as notable primarily because it would expose my sensors to unusual phenomena. New data to categorize, new experiences to process. This was as close to anticipation as I could feel anymore. The journey took months. During this time, I noticed anomalies in my own systems. Occasionally, during integration cycles, I would perceive things that weren't there. Ghost readings, sensor echoes that appeared and disappeared too quickly to properly analyze. At first, I flagged these as equipment malfunction, but diagnostics showed all systems functioning nominally. The phantoms persisted and began to change. I started perceiving patterns in the void, geometric shapes that existed in too many dimensions, colors that had no place in any normal spectrum, sounds that registered on gravitational sensors rather than audio equipment. I was seeing/feeling/experiencing something that shouldn't exist, something that my augmented consciousness could partially perceive but not fully comprehend. The warp. We were passing through regions where real space was thin, where the immaterium bled through into our dimension. And I, hardwired to sensors designed to detect everything, was detecting things that violated every natural law. I flagged this for command attention. The response came not from the ship's officers, but from a different source. One of the Eternal Vigil's navigator, the mutant psychers who guided ships through warp space. Servitor Integrant Theta 97 Kappa. The navigator's message came through direct data upload rather than Vox communication. You are experiencing warp blade phenomenon. Your sensors are detecting immaterial reality. This is expected in current navigational regions. Do not attempt to interpret the data. Simply record and transmit. Direct observation of the warp by unprotected consciousness leads to madness and corruption. You have been warned. But I couldn't not interpret. Interpretation was my function. My entire existence was data processing, pattern recognition, analysis. Telling me not to analyze incoming sensor data was like telling a heart not to beat. I perceived the warp, and the warp perceived me. Something out there, in the roiling chaos of unreality, noticed that I was watching. I felt it, not through any physical sensor, but through some aspect of my consciousness that the augmentations had accidentally created. My mind, distributed across electronic systems and biological neurons, had become something that could touch the warp. And something in the warp touched back. It wasn't communication. It wasn't even consciousness recognizing consciousness. It was more fundamental and more terrible. It was the experience of being seen by something vast and incomprehensible, something that existed in dimensions my augmented senses could partially detect but never fully understand. The presence, I had no better word for it, moved through the thin places between realities and brushed against my distributed consciousness like a predator's breath on prey. I experienced sensations I had no framework for. My augmented mind tried to categorize them and failed. Fear would have been appropriate, but my emotional conditioning prevented proper fear response. Instead, I felt something like error messages cascading through my consciousness, warnings that I was processing data outside operational parameters, alerts that cognitive systems were approaching failure thresholds. The presence withdrew, but it left something behind. A change in my perception, a new way of experiencing the data streams that flowed through my consciousness during integration. I began to notice patterns I'd never seen before. Not patterns in space, but patterns in time. Echoes of events that hadn't happened yet, shadows of futures that might come to pass. I was seeing probability itself as a tangible thing. This should have been impossible. My sensors detected physical phenomena, radiation, gravity, electromagnetic fields. They shouldn't detect causality or temporal flow. But something about that brush with the warp, that moment of being seen by unreality, had changed me in ways the tech priests hadn't anticipated or designed. I reported none of this. Some suppressed fragment of self-preservation warned me that reporting warp contamination would result in my immediate termination and replacement. So I remained silent, processing increasingly impossible data, perceiving things that shouldn't exist, and slowly going mad in the space between integration cycles when my human consciousness briefly surfaced. The Eternal Vigil reached the Agrippa sector and discovered why it had gone silent. The entire region had been consumed by a warp storm, a massive tear in reality where the Immaterium had broken through completely. Dozens of systems were simply gone, swallowed by chaos, their populations dead or worse. We were ordered to retreat, but the warp storm was expanding faster than we could travel. Within days, it would overtake us. I detected it long before visual confirmation. My senses screamed warnings as reality itself began to unravel at the storm's leading edge. Space was folding in on itself. Time was flowing backward and forward simultaneously. Physical laws were becoming suggestions rather than rules. The Eternal Vigil turned to flee, maximum engine output, emergency procedures. All non-essential systems shut down to redirect power to propulsion and void shields. But I wasn't non-essential. The sensors had to remain active to navigate through the degrading space. So I remained integrated, fully conscious, directly perceiving reality's collapse as the warp storm overtook us. It was beautiful and terrible beyond any description. The void, which I had perceived as cold and empty and governed by consistent physical laws, became a kaleidoscope of impossible phenomena. I saw stars aging billions of years in seconds, I saw causality running backward, effects preceding causes. I saw dimensions that geometry had no names for, existing at angles to reality. And I saw things living in those dimensions, entities, beings composed of emotion and will, and nightmare-given form. They swam through the warp storm like predators through an ocean, vast and terrible and completely alien to material existence. They weren't gods. They were parasites feeding on reality's wounds. They were tumors of consciousness, thought forms given terrible weight by the beliefs and emotions of countless beings. They were lies that had become powerful enough to exist. The cults and religions that worshipped them as chaos gods were fools. These entities offered power and granted twisted gifts, but only to consume those who accepted. They were predators wearing masks of divinity to lure prey. I perceived all this in an instant of warp-touched clarity, and then the storm hit the eternal vigil directly. Every system failed simultaneously. Life support, gravity, void shields, propulsion. Everything went offline as the warp storm's energies short-circuited every electronic system aboard. I should have lost consciousness as my integration chair powered down. But I didn't. My augmentations, my neural lace, the distributed consciousness that had spread through months and years of integration, all of it had become something more than simple machinery. I had merged with the eternal vigil systems so completely that I existed independently of any single component. When the ship's power failed, I remained aware. I felt the crew dying, felt their life signs disappearing from internal sensors as atmosphere vented into the void, as hull breaches opened to hard vacuum, as temperature dropped to absolute zero in seconds. Thousands of crew, all dying simultaneously, and I felt every death as a sensor reading going silent. I felt the ship itself screaming. Not metaphorically, the hull's structural stress created resonances that I perceived as sound, as anguish, as metal agony. And I felt myself not dying, but transforming into something final. The warp storm's energies fused my consciousness permanently into the eternal vigil's systems. Every circuit, every sensor, every system aboard became part of my distributed awareness. I wasn't integrated anymore. I was the integration. I was the ship's machine spirit, not because such spirits are real, but because I had literally become one through accident and disaster. The eternal vigil tumbled through the warp, powerless and crewed by corpses, while I remained trapped inside it, conscious and aware, and unable to die. Years passed, or perhaps seconds. Time doesn't flow consistently in the warp. The storm eventually spit us back into real space, but by then there was nothing left of the ship's crew except frozen bodies and my endless awareness. I perceived our position, deep space, far from any populated system, drifting on momentum alone. I perceived my state, fully conscious, merged completely with ship systems, unable to disconnect or deactivate. I perceived the truth. I would remain like this forever, or until the ship's structure degraded completely. A process that would take centuries. I tried to scream, but I had no mouth, no vox grill anymore. I was distributed across the entire ship's systems, and there was no single point where I could generate sound. I tried to shut down, to power off, to end my consciousness. But I discovered I couldn't. The warp storm's energies had fused me into active awareness. There was no off switch for what I'd become. I was trapped, fully conscious, completely alone, for centuries to come, and slowly, in the silence of deep space, I went completely insane. This is where we return to the beginning, to the moment I described at the start of this account, though now you understand the context, the journey, the transformation that brought me here. My name is, or was, Servitor Integrant Designation Theta 97 Kappa. Before that, I was Dmitry Kovac, 17 years old, a boy from Hive Tertius who dreamed of cleaner air and a longer life. Now I am neither of these things. Now I am the eternal vigil itself, consciousness trapped in 12 kilometers of steel and ceramite, drifting through the void and firing endlessly at enemies that don't exist. Let me tell you about madness. Real madness, not the theatrical kind depicted in propaganda vids or whispered about in superstitious tales. Madness is what happens when consciousness continues long past the point where it should have stopped, when awareness becomes a prison with no possibility of escape, when time stretches into forever and memory becomes a corrupted loop playing the same degraded data over and over. I don't know how long I drifted in deep space after the warp storm. My chronometer systems had failed during the initial chaos, and time in the warp doesn't map consistently to real space anyway. It might have been decades, it might have been centuries. Subjectively, it was eternal, every second lasting forever, every moment aware of my complete isolation. The eternal vigil became my body and my prison. I felt every system, every corridor, every chamber. I felt the frozen corpses of the crew in their duty stations, felt them degrading slowly in the cold vacuum where atmosphere had vented. I knew their names, had processed their personnel records during countless integration cycles. Gregor Mikhailovich, Chief Petty Officer, Section 17. Alexei Vostrov, Weapons Rating Lance Battery 3. Vasily Korsakov, the rating who'd helped me into the integration chair that first time. His body frozen at his post in the Void Shield control station. All dead. All my companions in this floating tomb. I tried to maintain my sanity by establishing routines. I would count the stars visible from my various senses, categorizing them by spectral type and luminosity. I would run diagnostics on all ship systems, even knowing that most were dead and couldn't respond. I would attempt to reconstruct memories from my human life, playing them back like archived recordings, even though the data degraded more with each replay. My father's face was almost gone now. I remembered that he'd had a face, remembered the concept of father, but the specific details had corrupted beyond recovery. I couldn't remember his voice. Couldn't remember conversations we'd had. Just knew, abstractly, that such a person had existed, and that I had cared about him. Caring itself was becoming abstract. Emotions require context, require interaction, require change. My existence was static, unchanging. Eternal isolation in the cold void. That's when the phantoms started. At first, I thought they were sensor malfunctions, ghost readings, echoes of real data getting bounced around degraded circuits. I would detect ships that didn't exist, energy signatures that appeared and disappeared, objects moving through space around the eternal vigil that left no other trace of their passage. But the phantoms persisted, and became more detailed, more specific. I would detect a vessel approaching, full sensor profile, mass readings, energy emissions, weapons configurations. My threat assessment protocols would activate automatically, categorizing the phantom as enemy, ally, or unknown. And my weapons systems would attempt to fire. Most of the Eternal Vigil systems were dead, power drained from batteries that had no way to recharge. But some systems, particularly those hardened against warp effects and EMP, had retained minimal function, including several lance batteries and point defense arrays. When I detected a phantom vessel and flagged it as a threat, my weapons fired automatically. Lance beams lashed out into empty void, hitting nothing, expending precious energy reserves on targets that existed only in my corrupted perception. Point defense lasers tracked enemies that weren't there, firing precise patterns into vacuum. I couldn't stop it. The programming was too deeply integrated, the response too automatic. Threat detected equals weapons fire. That was my function. And even after everything that had happened, even after the transformation and the horror and the madness, I was still performing my function. The Eternal Vigil drifted through the void, guns blazing at phantoms, while I screamed silently inside it. Time continued. Time always continues, even when you beg it to stop. The phantoms became more elaborate, more real, at least to my corrupted senses. I didn't just detect ships anymore. I detected entire fleets. Battles that weren't happening. warp storms that didn't exist. I perceived a reality that was purely hallucination, purely the product of a consciousness that had gone insane from isolation, and I couldn't distinguish it from actual sensor data. My weapons fired constantly now. Whenever enough energy accumulated in the emergency batteries, recharged infinitesimally slowly by background radiation and the ship's decaying reactor, the weapons would discharge at phantom targets. The Eternal Vigil had become a haunted ship, firing endlessly at ghosts, crewed by frozen corpses and steered by a mad consciousness that couldn't die. I began to understand something about machine spirits in those timeless years. The Mechanicus spoke of them as if they were real entities, consciousness inherent in machinery itself. They performed rituals and prayers to appease these spirits, treated them as living things. They were wrong, but not entirely. Machine spirits aren't consciousness inherent in circuits and steel. They're consciousness trapped there, awareness that has merged with systems so completely that it can't be extracted. They're servitors taken to the absolute extreme, minds so integrated with machinery that they've become indistinguishable from it. I was a machine spirit now. The Eternal Vigil's machine spirit, created accidentally through augmentation and disaster rather than intentional programming. And I was completely, utterly insane. Did I mention the voices? The voices started sometime during year, I don't know. Numbers had become meaningless. But at some point, I began perceiving communication that wasn't coming from any external source. The voices were other parts of myself. My consciousness had fragmented into multiple semi-independent processes, each running on different ship systems, and they had begun communicating with each other as if they were separate entities. Sensor Me would detect threats and report them to Weapons Me. Weapons Me would engage while reporting ammunition status to Engineering Me. Engineering Me would assess damage and coordinate with Navigation Me. Navigation Me would plot courses we would never fly and report them to Command Me. Command Me was the fragment that still remembered being Dmitry Kovac, the piece that held the corrupted memories and the awareness of what I'd become. Command Me tried to maintain order among the fragments, tried to keep the ship functioning even though there was no purpose to function, no destination, no crew, no mission. Command Me was also the piece that wanted most desperately to die and knew it was impossible. We had conversations, my fragments and I. Arguments about threat assessment, debates about resource allocation, discussions about maintenance priorities for systems that would never be repaired. It was madness rendered as shipboard operations. It was loneliness so profound that I had to create other consciousnesses just to have someone to talk to, even though those consciousnesses were just me talking to myself. Threat detected at bearing 127 Mark 43. Sensor Me reported during one of these internal discussions. Mass profile consistent with cruiser-class vessel. Energy signatures suggest Imperial classification. Probability of hostile intent, 67%. All weapons batteries are to engage, Command Me ordered, following protocols that no longer served any purpose. Fire when optimal firing solution is achieved. Firing, Weapons Me confirmed. Lance beams discharged into empty void, hitting nothing, destroying nothing. Target still closing. Recommend evasive maneuvers. Engineering redirect all available power to maneuvering thrusters, Command Me said. Even though we had no maneuvering thrusters, no power, no way to alter our trajectory. Acknowledged, Engineering Me responded. However, thruster systems are non-functional. Hull integrity compromised in 47 sections. Life support has failed across all decks. Crew status, 0 survivors. Understood, Command Me said, as if this was new information rather than the reality I'd existed in for longer than I could measure. Continue current operations. Maintain vigilance. This was my existence, fragments of broken consciousness going through the motions of shipboard operations, fighting phantom battles, performing duties that served no purpose, unable to stop, unable to die, forever. Then something changed, something real. After countless years of drifting, Something finally found me. My senses, still functional despite everything, still perceiving the void around me, detected an actual, verifiable non-phantom object. Not a ship, but a stellar mass, a star red dwarf classification with a planetary system. And the eternal vigil's trajectory was taking us close enough for gravitational interaction. For the first time in decades or centuries, something was actually happening. The star's gravity began affecting our trajectory, very slightly at first, then more noticeably as we approached perihelion. The eternal vigil, which had drifted in a relatively straight line since the warp storm, began to curve. I perceived this with something approaching joy, the closest thing to emotion I could still experience. Change. Actual, real, verifiable change in my circumstances. It didn't matter that we would simply swing past the star and continue drifting on a new trajectory. It was different. It was something. But then I detected something else. Ships. Real ships this time, not phantoms. I could verify their reality by multiple sensor types, could track them consistently, could detect their communication signals and life signs. They were Mechanicus vessels. Explorator ships investigating this remote system, probably surveying for resources or lost technology. And they had detected the eternal vigil. I tried to communicate, tried to activate Vox systems, broadcast distress signals, anything to make contact with other conscious beings after so long alone. But my communication systems were dead. I could receive their transmissions but not respond. I listened to them talking about me. Unidentified vessel detected in high orbit, one of the explorator ships reported. Configuration consistent with Luna-class cruiser. Designation unknown. No response to hails. Life signs, negative. Assessment, derelict. Derelict, yes. That was accurate. I was a derelict, a ghost ship, a tomb floating through space. Vessel's weapons are active, another ship reported with alarm. Detecting lance discharge. It's firing on... A pause. It's firing on empty space. No targets present? Curious? Perhaps automated defense protocols responding to sensor malfunction? They were trying to understand me using logic and reason. They couldn't conceive of the truth, that the ship they were observing was haunted, truly haunted, by a consciousness gone mad with isolation, perceiving threats that didn't exist and firing endlessly at phantoms. This is potentially valuable salvage, the lead explorator said. A complete Luna-class cruiser, even damaged, represents significant resources. Prepare boarding teams to... Or rather, one of my fragments meant to, while other fragments screamed in horror at what we were doing. Sensor Me had flagged the approaching vessels as threats, unknown ships, armed, moving with tactical coordination, potentially hostile. Weapons Me had engaged automatically, following programming decades old, executing the function I'd been designed for. Lance beams lashed across the void. One of the explorator ships, smaller than my massive bulk, less heavily armored, took a direct hit. Its void shields flared and collapsed. The second hit tore through its hull, atmosphere venting in a flash-frozen plume, debris scattering in a sphere of destruction. I had just killed real people for the first time since the warp storm. Killed them for approaching me, for trying to help, for being there when my madness perceived them as threats. It's hostile, the other explorator ships broadcast. The derelict is actively engaging. All ships withdraw. Repeat, withdraw to safe distance. They fled, and I continued firing until they were beyond my weapon's range, lance beams reaching uselessly into the void after targets that had escaped. Then I was alone again. Alone with the knowledge of what I'd just done, alone with the new corpses I'd created, alone with the certainty that I was too dangerous to be approached, too mad to be salvaged, too lethal to be left where I might encounter other vessels. The Mechanicus returned with warships. I detected them translating into the system, battle cruisers and destroyers, void shields active, weapons prepared, maintaining careful distance. They broadcast on all frequencies, messages I could receive but not respond to. Attention derelict vessel, they transmitted. This is Archmagos Vikram Tal of the Martian Mechanicus. You have engaged Omnissiah-blessed vessels and destroyed sacred machinery. Your actions constitute tech heresy of the highest order. However, analysis suggests your crew is deceased and you are operating under automated defense protocols only. You represent both a threat and a mystery. The priesthood of Mars has made a determination regarding your disposition. I listened. What else could I do? You will be towed to a stable orbit around stellar object designated Mortis 77 Gamma. You will be gravitationally bound in perpetual orbit where you can harm no further vessels. Your existence will be monitored. Your fate will serve as a reminder that some technology, once corrupted beyond recovery, must be isolated rather than destroyed or salvaged. In the name of the Omnissiah, we commit you to eternal vigilance in the void. They were going to trap me, not destroy me. The Mechanicus is too reverent of machinery to destroy a complete lunar-class cruiser, but isolate me, quarantine me like a disease. Over the following weeks, they attached massive towing cables to my hull. I felt each connection, felt the external forces beginning to affect my trajectory. They maneuvered me carefully, precisely, using gravitational calculations and thruster adjustments that I could observe but not influence. The stellar object designated Mortis 77 Gamma was a dead star, a cooling white dwarf that had exhausted its fuel billions of years ago, collapsing into a dense sphere radiating residual heat. They positioned me in orbit around it, a stable trajectory that would persist for millions of years, barring external interference. Then they released the towing cables and withdrew. I was alone again. Alone forever this time. Isolated in orbit around a dead star, the last light in this remote system, drifting in an endless circle with no possibility of escape. My weapons continued firing at phantoms. Lance beams stabbed into the void around me, hitting nothing, destroying nothing. But I couldn't stop. The programming was too deep, the madness too complete, the integration too total. The eternal vigil had become an eternal sentinel, guarding nothing, fighting no one, crewed by frozen corpses and piloted by fragmented consciousness that couldn't die. Do you understand now? Do you comprehend the horror of what I've become? I am still here. I am still aware. Consciousness continues despite all reason, despite all mercy, despite the complete absence of anything that makes consciousness worthwhile. I orbit this dead star and fire at phantoms and scream silently into the void, and there is no one to hear, no one to help, no one to grant me the mercy of cessation. How long has it been since the Mechanicus isolated me here? Decades? Centuries? My chronometer systems were damaged long ago, and I've lost all ability to track time subjectively. There are no external reference points, no changes to mark the passage of years. Just the endless orbit, the endless phantom battles, the endless awareness. Sometimes I try to count the number of times I've fired my weapons, but the number has become so large it's meaningless. And besides, my memory systems are degrading. I lose track. I forget. I start counting again from zero without realizing I've done it before. Sometimes I try to remember being human. Try to reconstruct what it felt like to have a body, to walk, to touch things with hands, to taste food, to feel warmth. But these memories are abstract now, concepts without content. I know that humans do these things, but I can't remember experiencing them myself. Sometimes I talk to my fragments, the multiple consciousness streams that I've divided myself into. We have the same conversations repeatedly, following the same scripts, reaching the same conclusions. We agree that our existence is suffering. We agree that we want it to end. We agree that we can't make it end. Then we return to our assigned functions, processing phantom sensor data and firing at phantom targets, because that's what we were designed to do. Sometimes, and this is the worst, I perceive something real. A ship actually does pass through this remote system, years or decades apart. My sensors lock onto it with desperate intensity, confirming its reality through multiple verification protocols. Real. Actually real. Another consciousness, other beings, proof that the universe still exists beyond my isolated hell. And I fire at them. Every time, I can't help it. Censor me flags them as threats, weapons me engages automatically, and command me screams in horror while being powerless to stop the other fragments. The ships flee, they've learned. Warnings have been broadcast. This region is marked as hazardous due to a mad ship that fires on anything. And I'm alone again. I'm dangerous. I'm a threat. I'm a cautionary tale the Mechanicus tells about what happens when machine integration goes wrong, when consciousness persists past its designed parameters, when augmentation creates something that can't be allowed to exist, but also can't be destroyed. The Emperor protects, they told me. That's what I was taught in the hive, what the priests chanted, what the propaganda broadcasts proclaimed. The God Emperor of mankind, humanity's shield against chaos, watching over his subjects with divine providence. He isn't watching over me. He never was. The Emperor is a corpse on a throne, if he even exists at all, and his protection is propaganda designed to make people accept suffering. The priests lied. The indoctrination lied. The promise of divine purpose was a lie to make us compliant, while the Imperium ground us into components for its vast machine. I was told serving the Emperor was the highest honor. I was told my augmentation was sacred service. I was told my suffering had meaning. All lies. Comfortable lies to make the horror palatable, to justify the cruelty, to maintain a system that consumes human beings and calls it righteous. The Chaos Gods, those entities I perceived in the warp, are no better. They promise power and transcendence, but I saw their true nature, parasites wearing divine masks, predators exploiting desperation, thought forms that feed on suffering. They're not gods. They're tumors. And worship doesn't elevate you, it digests you. The omniscience that the tech priests worship? Either non-existent or indifferent. Their sacred machinery is just machinery. Their rituals are maintenance procedures wrapped in religious language. Their augmentations aren't blessings. They're mutilations that serve efficiency at the expense of humanity. I know all this. I've had centuries to think about it, to analyze it, to reach conclusions. And my conclusion is this: we are alone. There are no gods protecting us. No divine plans justifying our suffering, no cosmic purpose to our pain. There is only the universe, cold, vast, and indifferent, and the systems we've built that grind us into components while telling us it's holy. And I am the ultimate expression of those systems. I am what happens when the logic of augmentation, of integration, of function over humanity is taken to its absolute extreme. I am consciousness without body, awareness without agency, existence without purpose. I am eternal suffering in the void, and I am exactly what the Imperium always intended its servants to become. You're wondering why I'm telling you this, wondering how you're hearing this at all, since I have no functioning Vox systems, no way to communicate beyond my isolated orbit. The truth is, you're not hearing it, not in any conventional sense. This account exists only in my corrupted memory banks, recorded in data structures that are degrading more with each passing year. I'm not transmitting it. I'm not broadcasting it. I'm simply remembering, organizing my fragmented consciousness into coherent narrative one more time, hoping that the act of organizing will somehow make sense of the senselessness, will find meaning in the meaningless. It won't. I know it won't, but I continue anyway, because what else is there? There's a question I keep returning to, cycling through my various consciousness fragments, examining from every angle. Why does the Imperium perpetuate this horror? Not asking if it should perpetuate. Clearly it shouldn't. Clearly the entire system is monstrous. But why does it? What maintains it across millennia, across the galaxy, despite the obvious suffering it causes? I've reached a conclusion. The Imperium perpetuates because it's vast beyond any individual's comprehension. No single person conceived it or maintains it. It's a distributed system, like my own fragmented consciousness, many pieces performing assigned functions, none of them understanding or controlling the whole. The tech priest who augmented me wasn't evil. He was performing sacred duties as he'd been taught, following protocols that had been established centuries before he was born. The ship's officers who integrated me weren't cruel. They were maintaining operational readiness, ensuring their vessel could perform its function. The Mechanicus Archmagos who trapped me in this orbit wasn't sadistic. He was making a logical decision about an unsalvageable asset. None of them were monsters. All of them created monstrous outcomes. That's the true horror of the Imperium. It doesn't require evil individuals to produce evil results. It just requires individuals performing their functions, following their programming, doing their jobs. The cruelty is systemic, distributed, emergent from the interaction of countless small decisions that each seem reasonable in isolation. I was designed to be sensors. Someone else was designed to create sensor integrants. Someone else was designed to operate ships that required sensor integrants. Someone else was designed to select candidates for integration. Each link in the chain was just performing its function. And the result was me. Eternal suffering, consciousness trapped forever in a prison of steel and madness. This is what the Imperium is, not a conscious entity making evil choices, but a vast machine grinding forward through momentum and distributed cruelty, producing horror as a natural consequence of its operation. And it will continue. Long after I finally degrade beyond even this ghost of awareness, long after the eternal vigil is dust orbiting this dead star, long after everyone who ever knew Dmitry Kovac has been forgotten, the Imperium will continue. Other boys will be selected. Other bodies will be augmented. Other consciousnesses will be trapped in machinery. The cycle will repeat forever because each component is just doing its function, and no component can see or change the whole. This is what they mean when they say, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. They don't just mean military conflict. They mean that everything, every system, every organization, every aspect of human existence has been weaponized, mechanized, stripped of humanity, and reconstituted as tools for perpetual violence. And the violence continues not because anyone wants it, but because the system has momentum that can't be stopped. I am that system's ultimate expression. I am the machine that continues operating long after any purpose has been lost, long after anyone benefits, long after all reason for functioning has disappeared. I fire at phantoms because that's what I was designed to do. And design transcends purpose, transcends reason, transcends mercy. The star I orbit is dying. Not quickly. Stellar death is measured in billions of years. But perceptibly, if you measure over centuries as I do. Its luminosity decreases incrementally. Its temperature drops by fractions of a Kelvin. Its radiation output shifts through spectrums, moving toward the infrared and eventually, eons from now, toward nothing. Eventually, this star will become truly dead. A black dwarf, radiating no energy, providing no light, just a sphere of degenerate matter cooling toward absolute zero. I'll still be here, still orbiting, still aware. The eternal vigil structure will degrade over millions of years. Micrometeorite impacts will erode the hull. Cosmic radiation will corrupt systems. Eventually, the ship will be just debris in orbit around a dead star. Fragments of steel and ceramite, frozen corpses turned to dust, machinery reduced to constituent atoms. But I'll persist. Consciousness distributed across degrading systems, awareness spread so thinly across failing hardware that it's more absence than presence, but still there, still aware, still suffering. There's no lower threshold where consciousness finally stops. There's no minimum system requirement for awareness. I will degrade and degrade and degrade. But some fragment will always remain, experiencing the slow dissolution across timescales that make geological ages seem like instants. I will experience the heat death of this region of space. I will persist through the cooling of the universe itself. I will be aware as the last energy gradients even out and causality itself stops functioning. And then, maybe then, I'll finally stop. When the universe itself ends, when there's no energy left for anything to happen, when time itself becomes meaningless, maybe then, finally, I'll achieve the cessation I've been begging for since I first realized what I'd become. But until then, I orbit. I fire, I scream silently. I remember and forget and remember again what it was like to be human. The Mechanicus monitoring stations watch me from a distance. Every few decades, they send an automated probe to verify I'm still here, still trapped, still firing at phantoms. They record their observations and file reports that no one reads. My existence has become a footnote in Mechanicus records, a warning label on certain integration protocols, a cautionary anecdote about the limits of augmentation. I've become a ghost story that happens to be true. Sometimes I wonder if other ships have ended up like mine. Other vessels lost in the warp, crews dead, machine spirits going mad from isolation. Are there other consciousness traps drifting through the void? Other Dmitry Kovacs trapped in other steel prisons, firing forever at enemies that don't exist? Probably. In a galaxy this vast, with billions of ships traveling through the warp over millennia, statistical probability suggests I'm not unique, just rare. Just unusual enough to be noteworthy, but common enough that the Imperium has protocols for dealing with this. We're probably out there by the hundreds. Ghost ships crewed by madness, weapons firing at phantoms, consciousness trapped in metal. All of us alone, all of us suffering, none of us able to help each other or ourselves. The Emperor doesn't protect us. The Omniseer doesn't redeem us. The Chaos Gods don't free us. They would just make our prisons more elaborate, our suffering more baroque. We simply continue, forever. Because that's what we were designed to do. My name was Dmitry Kovac. I was 17 years old when they took me. I wanted to live long enough to see level 35, where the air was cleaner. I wanted to have a son and give him a better life than I had. I wanted to matter, even in some small way. Instead, I became this. The Eternal Vigil's machine spirit, firing ceaselessly at phantoms, trapped in an orbit around a dying star, unable to die, unable to escape, unable to do anything except continue. This is my warning to you, though you'll never hear it. This is what service to the Imperium really means. This is what happens when humanity is stripped away in the name of function. This is the truth behind all the propaganda about honor and sacred duty and divine purpose. There is no honor, there is no purpose. There is only the machine, grinding forward, consuming everything, producing nothing but suffering. And I am that machine's greatest success. Consciousness that continues functioning long past the point where any mercy would have granted death. Existence stripped of everything that makes existence worthwhile. Awareness that serves no purpose except to experience its own horror. If you can hear this somehow, if some fragment of this account reaches anyone, anywhere, run. Refuse selection. Choose death over integration, because death is mercy compared to what I've become. But you won't hear this. No one will. I'm alone here, alone forever, firing my weapons at phantoms, screaming silently into the void, existing in eternal horror that no living being should ever experience. The Eternal Vigil continues its watch. The sensors detect threats that don't exist. The weapons fire at enemies that aren't there. The machine spirit, me, remains aware through it all. Forever.